We're going to move on now. We're going to continue with our topic of digital transformation. Now we want to talk about we want to maybe address the topic of disrupting or being disrupted. I'm really happy to welcome the Chief Digital Officer and the head of SAP Digital at SAP, Mr. Jonathan Becher. Have fun.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Oh, come on. Good afternoon. All right, I'll chop it up to a sleepy audience. So look, we all know that the world is rapidly changing. Hardly a day goes by when we don't read a press article that talks about how some company or some industry has been fundamentally disrupted. I live in Silicon Valley, and Silicon Valley likes to pretend that it's the center of disruption. But I travel a lot, and everywhere I go in the world, things change. In Asia, in Latin America, in Europe, and of course here in Germany. Things are changing so much that I feel like we're seeing more change than any time in human history since the Industrial Revolution. In fact, I like to think that the age that we're in should be called the digital revolution, and that history books will write it in the same way that the history books write the Industrial Revolution. But yet there are two fundamental differences from this revolution. The first is, in the old days, the change, the fuel of the change, was natural resources, primarily oil. This time, the fuel of the change is technology and the internet. And the second big difference, and probably the more important one, and the one we don't often think about, is the pace of change. In the past, changes came incrementally. There were linear improvements of the past. And the changes we're seeing now are not natural extensions of what came before, but rather exponential. Some of you may know a famous futurist that goes by the name of Ray Kurzweil. And Ray has famously said that we're going to see more change in the next 100 years than the last 20,000 years put together. Now that sounds pretty fun and pretty scary, but I admit I can't think about what's going to happen 100 years from now. It's unlikely that most of us in this room will still be listening to lectures like this 100 years from now. So I had a chance to meet Ray last year, and I said, change that quote so I can understand it. And he said, okay, I got a simpler one for you. We'll see more change in the next 10 years than the last 1,000 years. 1,000 years, we were in the middle of the Middle Ages. Think how different the world was 1,000 years ago. And he claims, and I believe, that the world will be that different again from where we are now in 10 years. That's the pace of change. I want to give you a specific example so we can think about how fast the world is moving. In 1985, the American telephone company, AT&T, we all know that company, hired McKinsey and asked them should they get in the mobile phone business. Now, for those of you who remember 1985, the mobile phone business wasn't a very big business. So McKinsey does what McKinsey does a fantastic job of it. They put a bunch of smart people on the problem. They interviewed, they studied, they reached trends, and they came back to AT&T, remember this is 1985, and said by the year 2000, there will be 1 million mobile devices. Extraordinarily large number to conceive of in 1985. But the challenge, they said, is it's going to be very expensive to build out a mobile network. You have to build cell towers and repeaters and a bunch of things. So we, McKinsey, do not recommend that you go after this market. Well, as you can see by the graph, in the year 2000, there were not 1 million mobile phones. There were 100 million mobile phones. McKinsey was off by a factor of 100. And today, mobile phones and mobile subscriptions are more than the number of human beings on the planet, somewhere north of 8 billion. How did McKinsey get it so wrong? Because they used linear thinking. They thought the future, the next year, was 10% or 20% or 30% better than the previous year. And every year was a linear extrapolation of the year that came before it. When in fact, mobile phones grew exponentially. 2x. Now, if you're a skeptic in the audience, or maybe if you're a math major, you may say, oh yes, Jonathan, but that's obvious in retrospect. How could they have possibly known? And I say, people are making the same mistake now. Look at that red line. All the supposed experts in the mobile market are saying, yeah, no more exponential. Next year will be linear, and the year after linear, and it's flattened out. And they might be right, but I, for one, am betting on exponential and not linear improvement. If you don't think exponential, and it's very, very hard to think exponential, our brains are not wired this way, you can make fundamental mistakes. Hopefully all of us remember Nokia, the Finnish telecom giant. In 2008, not so long ago, Nokia bought Navtech, the telemetrics company, phenomenally engineering company, wildly successful, and Nokia paid $8 billion to acquire Navtech. Why? The picture on the left-hand side of the screen. The sensors that allow cars to run around the road, and using those sensors, they mapped 500,000 kilometers of roads in 34 European capitals. And Nokia said this technology will allow us to compete with the emerging Google Maps. Emerging Google Maps seems not so long ago. That was linear thinking. At the same time, Nokia spent $8 billion, and my apologies if anyone is around from the company, a small Israeli startup named Waze decided to think exponentially and not think linearly. And they said, wait a minute, why do we need to invest in technology at all? This mobile thing is taking off, and every mobile device has a GPS inside of it. So rather than build any hardware whatsoever, we're just going to activate the GPSs and use that to allow consumers to map themselves. And the GPS will get faster and faster, the number of mobile devices will get more and more, and in fact, in 2 years since they were founded, they mapped as many miles as Navtech did in a decade. In 4 years, they'd already mapped 10x what Navtech did. Now, most of us probably know how the story ended. Nokia eventually got bought by Microsoft at a small fraction of what it paid to acquire Navtech, and Waze is now part of Google. So they out-Google Google. It's not always negative, though. It's not always that thinking exponentially causes bad things to happen or not thinking. Consider the healthcare business. 40 years ago in 1977, we mapped, not me, scientists mapped the human genome for the first time. It was very slow and very expensive. 20 years later, so 20 years ago, we were finally able to manufacture the first human cell. 5 years ago, we were able to organize those cells in such a way that they turn into physical limbs and can be used to treat people that have lost limbs and restore muscle mass so that you can actually move. Today, there's a device called the CRISPR, which can map the genome, the human genome, in seconds, that can use gene editing so that you can change the DNA of something like a plant crop and make it more drought resistant. All that has happened exponentially in the span of 40 years. I don't think any of us can imagine what might happen in 5 more. And so there's no doubt that in every industry, there are people that are thinking linearly and planning for next year as if it was a simple extension of this year. And there are other people in the same industry that are saying the future is a very different model than the past. Or as they like to say in the financial market, past performance is no indication of future gains. And because of that, the word digital and the concept of digital transformation has become ubiquitous. Frankly, I worry that people are starting to digital wash. They're taking linear thinking and they're adding the word digital to it and pretending that things are change. And so I've developed a 3-step litmus test to allow us to figure out whether real change is actually happening, real transformation. Not for us, for other companies, but for yourself, and to see if it's sustainable. And the first step of a real digital transformation is changing the experience that customers have when they interact with your company. Now look, I know that's not new advice. The concept of user experience has become very common. Everybody talks about it now. The problem is, when most companies want to transform, that's all they do. They only start to change the user experience and nothing else. So I want to give you an example that I'll come back to a few times to talk about what real change looks like. And I'm going to pick on my favorite industry, and that is the music industry. If we think of the music industry, I can remember, because I'm old enough, where we were given compact discs as a replacement for vinyl. Now, I don't know that vinyl records translates well for those of you that are native German speakers, but you'll all remember the very large discs that got moved down to compact disc, and everyone said, isn't that a great change to the customer experience? Because now you don't have that noisy hiss. Some of you may be purists and say, actually, the sound was better on vinyl than it is on compact disc. I don't want to get into that. But the real change of the experience was when we learned that we could put the compact disc in our computer and legally, or maybe not so legally, make a copy on our computer and share it with our friends. Music became portable. But I don't think that's a change in customer experience. The change in customer experience happened with Napster, or maybe more legally with iTunes, when we shifted from albums to songs. For most of my life, I bought an album when I really only wanted one or maybe two songs. And the other 12 songs on that album I had to have because that's the only way we can do it. iTunes legitimized that you could only buy the song that you wanted. Some of you may remember that there was outcry. Pink Floyd, Dark Side of the Moon was the one that was used as an example of, no, you must listen to that album in order that every song, no more. The concept of an album barely exists in the music industry. The change is now songs. This happens in almost every industry. Think about the technology industry and the first time you went to a website. On day one, when a website, what did people do? They took their very big brochures, they digitized them, they stuck them on the website, but that didn't really change the experience. It took 10 years before people figured out that a website was not a change in experience, it was a change in interaction model. Now, as cool as the music industry is, we still pay €1 for a song. If we want every song in the album, it's still €16. It changed the experience, but it didn't pass the second test. It didn't change the business model. And changing the experience is hard, but it's easy comparing to changing the business model. Because changing the business model is literally changing the way a company gets paid. And if there are one thing that companies hate to do, is they hate to change the way they get paid. So let's come back to the music industry to give an example of what disruption looks like there. Some of you may know of a music service called Spotify. I'll admit, it's a service I use quite a bit. And Spotify changed the business model by saying, you shouldn't buy music, you shouldn't even rent music, but you can pay €5 a month to have access to as much music as you want. Now, I've bought a lot of music in my life. I probably have bought more than 1,000 songs. Those 1,000 songs have cost me €1,000. But for €5 a month, I now have access to unlimited amount of music, tens of millions of songs. That's a fundamental change in a business model. The downside for me as a consumer, however, is the minute I stop paying that €5, I have no music. Because I don't own anything. I don't rent anything. I'm paying to get access to somebody else's library. That's a very different and powerful business model, and I wonder whether that's going to change the technology industry as well. In the technology industry, software, hardware, pick your fit, networking, we are used to buying. We've become a little bit used to renting. But what if you just paid for access? What if the model for that industry became like the model for music, for Spotify? That would be disruptive. But as disruptive as changing the experience and the business model is, in my opinion, nothing is as disruptive as changing the way products and services get built. For as long as I know, product development has always been built the same way. The producer tries to develop a service or a product as fast as they can, with as minimum cost as they can, but still hoping that it fits their buyer's need. It's been a relationship, a one-to-one relationship between the producer and the consumer. Earlier on in the process, hoping that what you produce has more uses, but you ignore everybody else. If the producer is a company, you ignore the needs of the employees. If the consumer is actually a company, you ignore those. You ignore suppliers and distributors. When you build a product, you're optimizing for what the customer wants. Very different way to develop goods and services, which is not about optimizing everybody's needs, the entire world. For those of you that have a business background, your goal is not to maximize market share anymore. When I talk market share, everybody that ever went to business school says, what are you talking about? That's rule number one, maximize market share. Your goal is to maximize the size of the market, even if that means you have a smaller share, because a smaller percent share of a small market. Now, there aren't very good examples of this in the music industry yet. Some people think YouTube will eventually get from a different creative industry, and that industry is design. Right now, the design of film, the design of anything creative, typically goes through agencies. And the relationship between a brand and its agency is very much the traditional producer-consumer now. But there are value networks. One example is a firm called Design Crowd that allows you to go on and say, I'd like the following thing to be created, whatever that thing might be. And anybody on the planet can bid to create that. A professional, an amateur, a firm, an individual. And because anyone can bid on it, the prices tend to be much lower, and the quality tends to be depending on what it is. So how does the market get bigger? People to put things out to design they never would have been before. As an example, these slides. These slides, I put them on for who I will never know his or her real name. I have no idea if that person slides for 100. I discovered I could have probably gotten bid for more like 20 euro, so I never would have given that to a traditional advertising agency. They couldn't have done it. Hours of my time to try to make fancy slides. So the market for creative services goes up. Each individual person has a, that's how this works. So if you really want to digitally transform, you have to do three things. Change the way customers and consumers interact with you, a new experience. Destroy your business model. Change the way you make money. And do not think about a one-way relationship between yourself and your customers. Think about a network effect. If you don't do all three, you're unlikely to be as successful. Now, it's easy for me to stand up on the stage and say statements like this, but I'm taking a bit of my own medication, or medicine, I guess, is maybe a better way to say it. Despite the fact that SAP is a wildly successful software company, we ourselves recognize that the world of software is fundamentally changing. And no, I don't mean the standard buzzwords of mobile and cloud and big data and Internet of Things. I mean that we can't possibly imagine, no one on the planet can possibly imagine how the software industry might look like 10, 20, 30 years from now. So we're changing the customer experience. We're changing the way our business model works, and we're going to a value creation model and engineering our own disruption as well. Why? If we don't do it, somebody else will. So let me give you an example. Your mental model of enterprise software is something that costs a fair amount of money, takes a long time to decide on and buy, and even a longer time to implement. Why shouldn't enterprise software work like your personal life? Today, if you want to buy a book, you have the option to go in a bookstore and talk to an expert on a book and get a recommendation of what book you should buy, whether it's fiction or poetry. But you also have the option to go buy that book online in a physical format or in a digital format. Why couldn't enterprise software work that way? Why couldn't you buy it digitally, Why couldn't you consume it digitally? Why couldn't software go from wanting it, to buying it, to going live, to using it in under an hour? It's a heretical statement, of course. It's what a Silicon Valley person would call a BHAG, a big, hairy, audacious goal. But somebody will eventually do it, so why shouldn't we? In my role of Chief Digital Officer of SAP, one of the things I'm doing is imagining futures like that and asking what changes we have to make and how we process payments and how we do contracts and how we install software and how we go live that could allow anyone on the planet, all 7.5 billion, to buy and use an SAP piece of software with as little human interaction as they want. If they want a lot, they can have a lot, and if they want none, they can have none. It's such a disruptive idea that sometimes my colleagues say to me, oh, you're the CDO. You're not the Chief Digital Officer. You're the Chief Disruption Officer. And I think that's a fitting way to go back to where we started. I believe that every company in every industry has to change. I believe that no matter how successful you are today, no matter how profitable you are, no matter how protected your company seems to be from competitive pressure, you have to change, and you have to change now. Not next year, not next quarter, not next week, not even tomorrow, but today. I believe the mental model that everybody has to have is disrupt yourself before somebody else disrupts you. Put yourself in the shoes of the Nokia executives. They paid $8 billion for incredibly good technology. Navtech was an admired company. They would not have paid $8 billion if it was not one of the most admired companies on the planet. And yet within 2 years, the technology had been disrupted. If you aren't thinking that way, somebody else is. Now, when I say that, the most common thing I get is people say, but Jonathan, okay, maybe, but where do I start? I'm a very big company. I'm a very successful company. Where do I start? And my answer is quite simple. Anywhere. The single worst decision you can make is to do nothing. Doing anything, even something that's not very well thought out, is 1,000,000 times better than waiting till tomorrow. Which allows me to end essentially where I started. Because the final and the most compelling thing people say to me is, okay, I believe I have to start. I will try anything, but I need top-down support. I need management to believe that we have to change. I need my board, my boss, etc. And I say, real change never happens top-down. No revolution started with the head of a state. We are here at the digital economy, at Deconomy. In our hearts, every one of us are deconomists. That's why I borrowed the Margaret Mead quote that you see on the slide behind me and say, the revolution only starts with you. Go out and disrupt your companies, and you alone will change the world. Thank you.